My husband married a young woman and told the children, "Now you have a real mom." The children called me, crying. I calmed them down and said, "Wait until Friday." On Friday morning, the new wife discovered what he was hiding from her. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. For a long time, I believed I had built something real. Not perfect, no marriage is like, but real. Solid. The kind of life you point to when someone asks if hard work pays off. David and I had been together for 11 years. We met in our mid-20s, both of us still figuring out who we were, and somehow we figured it out together. We bought a house in Columbus, Ohio. A pale yellow colonial with a porch swing and a maple tree in the front yard that turned blood orange every October. We had 2 kids, Lily, who was 9, and Noah, who was 7. I worked as a senior accountant at a mid-size firm downtown. David ran sales for a commercial real estate company. On paper, we were steady. In practice, for the last 2 years of our marriage, we were strangers sharing a mortgage. The divorce wasn't explosive. That was almost the worst part. There was no dramatic confrontation, no thrown dishes, no single moment I could point to and say, "There, that's where it ended." It dissolved slowly, like sugar in lukewarm water. We went to mediation. We divided the assets, or so I thought. David kept the investment accounts. I kept the house. We agreed on joint custody. The kids would spend weekdays with me during the school year and alternate weekends with their father. Everyone in my family said I was being too reasonable. My mother said I was being a fool. I told her I just wanted it to be over. The first thing I noticed, really noticed, not just filed away and ignored, was in March, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. Lily mentioned, almost casually, the way children mention things they don't yet understand are significant, that Daddy's apartment had a new couch, a big one, white leather. "It was delivered, Mom, with 2 men." I smiled and said that was nice. But David had told the mediator he was renting a 1-bedroom and living lean while he got back on his feet. White leather sectionals are not the furniture of a man getting back on his feet. Then Noah said something about a trip. "We're going to Scottsdale with Tiffany in April." I asked who Tiffany was. Noah shrugged the way 7-year-olds shrug. Total, cheerful indifference. Daddy's friend. "She smells like flowers." I told myself it was nothing. He was allowed to date. So was I. The divorce was final. But Scottsdale was not cheap, and David had spent 6 months telling me he couldn't increase his share of the kids' extracurricular expenses because money was incredibly tight. I started paying closer attention, not obsessively, not at first. I would ask the kids small questions after their weekends, the kind that sound like normal parental interest. How was the food? Did you go anywhere fun? What does Tiffany's place look like? And the answers came in fragments, the way children's answers always do. Incomplete, vivid in the wrong places, missing the context that would make them meaningful. But the fragments accumulated. Tiffany had a car David drove sometimes. Tiffany's apartment, not David's, Tiffany's, had a guest room for the kids. Tiffany wore a ring by summer. The phone call came on a Tuesday in September. I was at my desk running quarterly projections when my cell buzzed. Lily. I answered immediately because Lily never called from school. Her voice was thick, the way voices get when someone has been crying for a while and is trying to hold it together for an audience. "Mom," she said, "Dad got married." I set down my coffee. "What, sweetheart?" "He married Tiffany on Saturday." We were there. A pause, then quieter. He said, "Now we have a real mom." I remember the exact quality of the silence in my office after she said that. The hum of the air conditioning. Someone laughing in the hallway. The cursor blinking on my spreadsheet. I remember thinking, with a strange clinical detachment that I needed to be very careful in the next 30 seconds because my daughter was on the phone and she was 9 years old and she needed me to be the adult in this moment, regardless of what was detonating quietly behind my ribs. "He said that to you?" I asked. "In front of everyone. Grandma Helen clapped." Noah was crying in the background now, the helpless, gasping cry of a little boy who doesn't fully understand why he's crying, only that something has shifted and he doesn't like it. I kept my voice level. I told them I loved them. I told them that nothing, not a wedding, not a sentence, not anyone's applause, could change what they were to me or what I was to them. I told them that I was their mother. That would never be reclassified. And then I said, "Don't worry, my loves. Wait until Friday." I didn't know yet exactly what Friday would look like, but I knew, with the cold, certain clarity of someone who has spent 15 years working with numbers that don't lie, that I was going to find out what David had been hiding. Because men who say things like, "Now you have a real mother in front of their new wife's in-laws," they are not just cruel, they are confident. And confidence like that, in my experience, always has a financial foundation. I just had to find it. That evening, after I picked up the kids and fed them dinner and read to Noah and sat on the edge of Lily's bed until her breathing finally slowed into sleep, I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine I didn't touch and a yellow legal pad I filled front to back. I wrote down everything I remembered. The mediation settlement had awarded David the joint brokerage account, roughly $47,000 at the time of valuation, plus his 401k, his car, and his share of the business partnership he held with a colleague named Greg Harmon in a small commercial property, LLC. I had received the house, my own retirement account, and child support set at $1,400 per month. At the time, I had accepted this as equitable. The house was worth $310,000. The brokerage account, $47,000. It seemed balanced. But now, I sat at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, and I thought about white leather couches and trips to Scottsdale, and a woman with a ring on her finger driving a car that David sometimes used, and I thought about the LLC. Had I actually looked at the LLC? I had not. Not really. My attorney at the time? A perfectly competent woman named Sandra, who handled mostly straightforward cases and had probably never litigated a hidden asset case in her professional life, had accepted the disclosure David submitted at face value. The LLC, according to his filing, had been dissolved 6 months before the divorce proceedings began. It was listed as having no residual value. I pulled up my laptop. I went to the Ohio Secretary of State's business search portal. I typed in the name of the LLC, Harmon Mitchell Properties Group. It was not dissolved. It was active, updated 4 months ago. I stared at the screen for a long time. My wine glass sat untouched. The maple tree outside tapped one branch lightly against the window, the way it always did in September wind. And for a moment the sound seemed almost gentle, almost like a reminder. Pay attention. Was I afraid? Yes. I want to be honest about that. Because it would be easy to write this story as though I was some fearless woman who sprang into action the moment she smelled injustice. That's not who I am. I'm an accountant from Columbus who drives a Honda Civic and buys her coffee at the gas station because the drive-thru is faster. I was terrified. I was terrified because what I was looking at, if I was right, meant that my divorce settlement had been built on fraudulent disclosures, and pursuing that meant attorneys, and hearings, and David's anger, and potentially dragging my children through a second round of legal proceedings that would disrupt the fragile equilibrium we had only just begun to establish. But then I thought about Lily's voice on the phone. Now you have a real mom. I thought about Noah crying in the background. I thought about who had stood in that delivery room 9 years ago. Who had sat in the parking lot of Children's Hospital at 2 in the morning when Noah had croup and the steam wasn't working and we weren't sure we needed the ER. I thought about 11 years and a pale yellow house and blood orange maple leaves and a legal pad full of numbers that did not add up. Fear is useful when it makes you careful. It is not useful when it makes you still. I decided to be careful and moving at the same time. The plan came to me in stages, the way plans do when you're an accountant and you think in systems. First, information. Before I could do anything official, I needed to know what I was actually dealing with. The LLC filing was a thread, but threads unravel from specific ends. I needed to know the property portfolio, the current valuations, and whether David had transferred any personal assets into the LLC's name around the time of our divorce proceedings. Second, legal counsel, not Sandra. Someone who specialized in post-decree modifications based on fraudulent financial disclosure. Third, documentation. Everything I found needed to be preserved in a form that was admissible and clean. I wrote those 3 steps on the legal pad and underlined them twice. Then I looked at the calendar. It was Tuesday. The kids went back to David's on Friday evening for the weekend. Friday. I had told them to wait until Friday. I didn't have a specific event planned for Friday yet. But I had told my children something, and I was going to make it true. That was not negotiable. Whatever happened between now and then, by Friday morning, something would have shifted. I would make sure of it. I closed the laptop, washed my wine glass, and went to bed. I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the house settle around me. My house, still my house, paid for and held. And I made myself breathe slowly. I had done harder things than this. I had pushed a human being into the world twice without so much as a whimper of self-pity. I had rebuilt a life from the wreckage of a marriage while raising 2 small children and maintaining a full-time career without missing a single parent-teacher conference. David Mitchell thought he had outmaneuvered me. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. The next morning, I dropped the kids at school and drove directly past my office. I kept going until I reached the address I had found at 11:30 the night before. Carver and Webb, Family Law. I had found them through 2 hours of research, cross-referencing attorney reviews, bar association records, and specifically looking for Ohio practitioners who had litigated post-decree fraud cases. The firm appeared on 3 separate legal forums in the context of hidden asset divorces. One commenter, anonymous but specific in the details, described a case where an attorney at the firm had successfully petitioned for a settlement reopening based on a fraudulently reported LLC. That was close enough. The receptionist fit me in for a 10 o'clock consultation with a woman named Patricia Carver. Patricia Carver was 61 years old, compact, silver-haired, and had the particular kind of stillness that very competent people develop after decades of watching other people panic. She let me speak for 20 minutes without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, none of them about my feelings. Then she said, if the LLC was active during the disclosure period and he reported it as dissolved, that is fraudulent misrepresentation in a legal proceeding. Ohio courts take that seriously. What does seriously mean in practice, I asked. It means the settlement can be reopened. If we establish the fraud, the court can revisit asset division, potentially order him to pay attorney's fees, and in egregious cases, there are contempt implications. She tapped her pen against her notepad once. But we need documentation. What do you have? I showed her the Secretary of State screenshot. She nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods when a test result confirms a suspicion. That's your thread. We pull it. She laid out the next steps methodically. A formal public records request for the LLC's property filings, a subpoena for the financial records if we move to litigation, and a private forensic accountant she recommended who specialized in business asset tracing. I retained her that morning. I wrote the check with a hand that was perfectly steady. The forensic accountant, a dry, meticulous man named Harold Fenn, agreed to an initial consultation the following day. Within 48 hours of Lily's phone call, I had an attorney and a forensic accountant, and I had a thread that was already beginning to unravel. Harold pulled the public property records in 3 days. What he found made him call me at 7 in the evening, which I understood to be unusual for him because he struck me as someone who preferred email. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "are you sitting down?" The LLC was not dissolved. It had never been dissolved. In fact, in the 14 months preceding the divorce filing, the LLC had acquired 2 additional commercial properties in the Columbus metro area. The total portfolio, 3 properties assessed conservatively, was worth approximately $380,000, with an estimated equity stake for David's 50% share of around $190,000. All of it had been omitted from the financial disclosure. All of it had been invisible in our settlement. But there was more. 3 months before I filed for divorce, around the time David had presumably understood that the marriage was ending, a significant asset transfer had occurred within the LLC's structure. A residential property that had been held personally in David's name, a rental house in Westerville he had inherited from his father, had been transferred into the LLC. The assessed value, $215,000. He put it in the company's name before the proceedings, Harold said, before the disclosure period. It's not accidental. The timing is, it's quite deliberate. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger, where I had stopped on the way home. Bags of groceries slowly warming in the back seat, and I felt something click into place that I can only describe as the sensation of a room coming fully into focus. Every soft, forgiving benefit of the doubt instinct I had nurtured through 2 years of post-divorce co-parenting and careful emotional management simply crystallized. Not into rage, into clarity. He had lied, under oath in a legal proceeding, in front of our children's future. He had lied. 2 days later, the thing I had not planned for happened. David called me, not for a custody scheduling matter, not about the kids' dentist appointments or school pickup changes. He called, and after a brief, awkward silence, he said, "Karen, I heard you've been asking around about some old business stuff. I just want you to know there's nothing there. That company was basically inactive. I just hadn't gotten around to the paperwork." I said, "I appreciate you letting me know, David." He paused. "We should probably just let things stay settled for the kids' sake." "Absolutely," I said, "for the kids." I hung up and texted Patricia Carver. He just called me. Unsolicited, referenced the LLC unprompted. She texted back 4 minutes later. "He knows. Document that call, date, time, exact words. Don't respond to him again without telling me first." There it was, the point of no return, which is never a dramatic moment, never a thunderclap. It is almost always a phone call from someone who has just realized they have something to lose, trying to sound casual, trying to sound like nothing is happening. Because the worst thing about guilty people is that they always assume the innocent are as calculating as they are. David thought he was warning me off. He had actually just confirmed everything. Patricia filed the motion to reopen the divorce settlement on a Thursday morning in October. She had spent 3 weeks building the filing into something airtight. Harold's forensic report, the public property records, the Secretary of State documentation, a timeline of the asset transfer to the LLC cross-referenced against the date David had retained his divorce attorney. The motion alleged fraudulent financial disclosure and requested full discovery of the LLC's records, David's personal accounts for the relevant period, and the Westerville rental properties transfer documentation. It was 42 pages long. Patricia couriered a copy to David's attorney of record at 9 in the morning. By noon, my phone was ringing. Not David. His attorney, a man named Clifford Bryce, whose name I had heard mentioned in legal circles as someone who played hard and sometimes played rough. He left a voicemail that was professionally courteous and completely threatening underneath. He wanted to schedule a call to discuss whether this matter could be resolved without the court's involvement. That is lawyer language for, your client should stand down before this gets worse for her. I forwarded the voicemail to Patricia and did not return the call. What I did not anticipate was Tiffany. I had not, in all my planning, thought very carefully about Tiffany as a variable. I had thought about David. I had thought about his attorney. I had thought about the LLC and the properties and the paper trail. Tiffany had existed in my mind mostly as a peripheral fact. Younger, decorative, newly married to a man I had already finished grieving. I had not considered that Tiffany might have been more actively complicit than a new bride typically would be. Harold disabused me of that assumption on a Tuesday afternoon when he called with an update. The Westerville property, he said carefully. The transfer into the LLC. I've been tracing the ownership structure more carefully. A pause. Mrs. Mitchell. The LLC was restructured about 2 months after the divorce was finalized. David's ownership stake was partially transferred. He now holds 30%. The other 20% was assigned to a new member. Who? I asked, though I already felt I knew. Tiffany Rawlings Mitchell, your husband's current wife. So she wasn't peripheral. She was a co-architect. The property David had hidden from our settlement, the rental house worth $215,000, was now partially in her name. She hadn't just married into this situation. She had been built into its legal structure, which meant she had known, which meant the rings and the Scottsdale trip and the white leather couch and the now you have a real mother. All of it had been constructed on a foundation of fraud that Tiffany had agreed to participate in. I sat with that for about an hour. Then Tiffany herself arrived at my house. It was a Wednesday evening. The kids were with me. I was making dinner when the doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, she was standing on my porch in a camel coat, her dark hair blown sideways by the October wind, holding what appeared to be a bottle of wine. She was 26 years old, and she was very pretty. And she looked, in that moment, deeply uncomfortable. "Karen," she said, "I think we should talk." She came inside. I don't know why I let her in, probably because the kids were in the next room, and a scene on the porch was not something I wanted to create. And we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had written my legal pad notes 3 weeks ago. And she said what people in her position always say, that she hadn't known the full extent of what David had done, that she had signed documents without reading them carefully, that she was just trying to protect herself in a relationship with a man who could be controlling. Was any of it true? Possibly. Partially. Human beings are almost never wholly one thing. But I also noticed that she had not come to my house out of remorse. She had come because Patricia's motion had landed, and she was now named as a party with financial exposure. She had come because she was frightened of what discovery would reveal. "I think if you dropped this," she said carefully, measuring each word, "it would be better for everyone, for the kids. They don't need any more disruption." There it was, the invocation of my children as a lever. "Tiffany," I said, just as carefully, "I appreciate you coming. I really do. But you should know that invoking my children's well-being as a reason for me to allow financial fraud to go unchallenged, that is not going to work on me. And anything else you'd like to say to me should probably go through your attorney." She left. The wine bottle remained on my counter. I put it in the recycling and finished making dinner. The following week, David's attorney sent a letter threatening a counter motion, alleging that my petition was a bad faith attempt to harass and warning of sanctions. It was a bluff. Patricia told me so immediately. But it was an aggressive one, and reading it at my desk on a Friday morning made my hands shake slightly. I took the following Monday and Tuesday off work. I drove to my sister's house in Cincinnati, slept in her guest room, played board games with her kids, let her feed me chili and cornbread, and did not think about attorneys for 48 hours. It was not weakness, it was maintenance. You cannot sustain a long fight on an empty tank, and I had learned, somewhere in the long education of the past decade, to know the difference between resting and retreating. I came back on Wednesday. The paperwork was still on my desk. The thread was still unraveling. November arrived the way Ohio Novembers do. Sudden gray, stripping the last color from the maple tree and replacing it with the flat, honest light of a season that doesn't try to be beautiful. I had always liked November for that reason. It was a month that told the truth. In the first week of November, David sent me a text message that was not routed through attorneys and therefore was, technically, a violation of the communication protocol we had established. It was not threatening. That was what made it effective, or what was designed to make it effective. It read, "Karen, I've been thinking. I handled things badly. I know that. If you're willing to sit down, just the two of us, I think we can work something out that's fair to everyone without destroying whatever's left of this family for the kids." I read it twice. I acknowledged to myself that it was well crafted. The self-blame, the appeal to the children, the suggestion that I was the one with the power to prevent destruction. It was the text message version of Tiffany on my porch. I forwarded it to Patricia and did not respond. Patricia's reply, "Good. Classic pressure move. They're worried. Let them worry." What I noticed most about that week and the weeks that followed was my own internal weather. I had expected to feel more anger, more satisfaction at their panic, more anxiety about the outcome. What I actually felt was a kind of settled calm that I had not experienced in years. It was not the numbness that follows devastation. It was something more deliberate, more architectural. I had examined the situation. I had made a decision based on evidence. I had put the right people in place, and now the process was running. My job was to not interfere with it. Was I ever tempted to simply accept a quiet settlement and walk away? I would be lying if I said the thought never occurred to me. There are real costs to legal proceedings: financial, temporal, emotional. Every hour Patricia spent on my case was billable. Every document Harold subpoenaed cost money, and more than money. Every week this continued was a week in which my children existed inside a complicated adult situation they couldn't fully understand. But then I would think about the Westerville rental house, about $190,000 in LLC equity quietly omitted from a legal disclosure, about a man who had looked at our shared history and decided I was someone he could defraud without consequence because I was too tired or too conflict-averse or too focused on the children to fight back. And the temptation dissolved every time. In mid-November, I had coffee with my friend Renata, who had been through her own difficult divorce 3 years earlier and had emerged from it with a clarity I had always admired and now finally understood. We met at a coffee shop near the university. the kind with exposed brick and mismatched furniture that always made me feel like a graduate student again. And I told her everything: the LLC, the properties, Harold's findings, Tiffany's visit, David's text. Renata listened without interrupting, the way good friends do. Then she said, "How are you sleeping?" "Better than I have in 2 years," I said honestly. She nodded. "That's how you know you're doing the right thing." She also connected me with a women's support group she had joined during her own proceedings. Not a therapy group exactly, more of a practical network. Women who had navigated family court, who had dealt with hidden assets and attorney letters, and the particular loneliness of fighting a battle that most people around you would prefer you resolved quietly. I went to their monthly meeting in late November. I sat in a church basement in Clintonville with 8 other women, and I listened, and I talked, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, that what I had mistaken in myself for stubbornness was actually something closer to self-respect. Meanwhile, David and Tiffany had gone quiet. Not entirely. Patricia received correspondence from Clifford Bryce periodically, procedural volleys, requests for extensions, the usual friction of litigation. But the personal contact had stopped. No more texts. No more visits. I understood this to mean they were either building something or waiting for something, and I stayed alert to both possibilities without letting the alertness become paranoia. I continued to show up for my children. I went to Noah's soccer games in the cold and clapped until my hands hurt. I helped Lily with a history project about the civil rights movement that she was enormously proud of. I made Sunday dinners and read books and kept the house warm. My life was not suspended in the service of this legal battle. The legal battle was a single thread in a life that was much larger than it. That was, I think, what David had never understood about me. He thought the life was the marriage. He thought that when the marriage ended, I had nothing left to fight for. He had not been paying attention. The first Saturday of December, David came to my door. Not Tiffany this time. David himself, alone, no attorney and no wine bottle, standing on the porch in the early winter cold with his collar turned up and an expression on his face that I recognized from 11 years of marriage as his version of vulnerability. He had always been a capable performer of vulnerability. It was the expression he used when he wanted something and had calculated that sincerity was the most efficient path to it. I opened the door but did not invite him in. The kids were at his mother's for the afternoon, a scheduled visit that he almost certainly knew about. He had timed this deliberately. "Karen," he said, can I come in for a minute? Please." I stepped aside. He came in and stood in the hallway, looking around the house with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Not nostalgia exactly. Something more transactional. He followed me to the kitchen and sat at the table without being asked. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said that the LLC situation was more complicated than it looked, that Greg Harmon had structured things in ways he hadn't fully understood, that his attorney had given him some bad advice early on. He said that he felt terrible about what Lily had said on the phone, about the real mom comment, and that he hadn't meant it the way it came out, and that Tiffany had encouraged him to say something positive about the family they were building. I listened to all of this. Then he got to the point. He had a proposal. He wanted to settle. Specifically, he proposed paying me $85,000, a lump sum, structured as a correction to the original settlement, in exchange for my withdrawing the motion and signing a full release of all further claims. $85,000. Against the $190,000 in LLC equity Harold had documented. Against the $215,000 Westerville property. Against the attorney's fees. I would recoup if we won. It was an offer that assumed I was frightened or exhausted enough to accept less than half of what I was owed, in exchange for the relief of it being over. I think you should talk to Patricia, I said. His expression shifted, just slightly. The vulnerability performance gave way to something flatter and less practiced. Karen, if this goes to a hearing, it's going to be ugly. The kids are going to be affected. Is that what you want? Really? David, I said calmly. You're asking me whether I want my children to be affected. You're asking me this at a table in the house I raised them in, after you told them they now have a real mother. I would like you to think about the sequence of events there. He looked at me for a moment, and what I saw in his face was something I had not seen before in our entire relationship. Genuine uncertainty. He didn't know what I was going to do. He was used to being able to read me, to predict me, to factor me into his calculations as a known quantity, and I had become, somewhere in the past 2 months, something he could no longer predict. Then the flat look returned, and with it, something colder. You know what Clifford's going to do in that hearing room, he said. He's going to go through every decision you made in this marriage. Your job, the kids' school, every time I had concerns you dismissed. He's going to make the case that you drove this family apart. He paused. Is that the story you want your kids to hear? There it was, the actual message under all the softness. Cooperate, or we will humiliate you. I stood up. I think you should leave, I said. And David, the next time you want to have a conversation like this, it goes through Patricia, not my front door. He left. He slammed the door, not violently, but firmly enough that I heard the frame shudder. I stood in the kitchen and let the silence settle back in around me. And yes, I felt fear. A cold, specific fear of exactly the thing he had described. A hearing room, Clifford Bryce's voice, my children's confusion, but the fear did something unexpected. It did not deflate me. It ran through me like a current and came out the other side as something hard and clean and absolutely immovable. They were afraid of what Patricia had built. That was why he had come. Frightened people do not offer $85,000 to people who have nothing. Frightened people do not threaten reputational damage in divorce proceedings unless they believe the alternative, a full discovery process, is worse for them than the battle. I called Patricia. I told her about the visit, the offer, the threat. She said, "The offer is confirmation. Don't accept it. We're close." The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in January, 3 months after Patricia had filed the original motion. By then, Harold had submitted his full forensic report, 67 pages, documented to a standard that Patricia said was the cleanest work she had seen in 15 years. The report established in itemized cross-reference detail the LLC's active status throughout the disclosure period, the portfolio value of 3 commercial properties totaling $380,000 in assessed value. David's 50% equity stake of approximately $190,000, and the pre-disclosure transfer of the Westerville rental property, valued at $215,000 from David's personal ownership into the LLC structure, 14 months before the divorce filing. Total undisclosed assets, $405,000. That number sat in the court filing, quiet and devastating, the way numbers always are when they finally appear after a long time of being hidden. I dressed carefully that morning. Not to impress anyone. I want to be clear about that. I dressed carefully because there is a form of self-respect that expresses itself through small, deliberate choices, and I had learned, over the preceding months, to treat my own preparation as something worth taking seriously. Navy suit, low heels, my grandmother's earrings, small pearl drops she had worn to every important moment of her life. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long moment before leaving, and I said nothing aloud, but I thought, I did the work. Now let it speak. Patricia met me in the courthouse lobby and looked at me for a moment before saying anything. Then she said, "How are you?" "Ready?" I said. And I was. I want to be accurate about this because it would be easy to describe the hearing as a moment of triumph and let the emotional reality of it blur into something cinematic. The truth is that what I felt, sitting down at the plaintiff's table, was not exhilaration. It was a deep, functional calm. I had done the work. Harold had done the work. Patricia had done the work. The documentation existed. The numbers did not lie. Whatever happened in this room had already been determined by what we had built over the previous 3 months. David and Tiffany sat at the respondents' table. Clifford Bryce was between them, broad-shouldered, silver-suited, projecting the professional confidence I had been warned about. Tiffany was in a gray dress I suspected had been selected by someone's advice. She did not look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way people do when they are trying very hard to appear composed and are not entirely succeeding. David looked at me once briefly, and I held his gaze until he looked away. The hearing began. The judge, a woman in her mid-50s named the Honorable Margaret Sorensen, whose reputation Patricia had described as exacting and unsentimental, received Harold's report and allowed him to walk through its findings. Harold was an extraordinary witness. He spoke the way he did everything else, with the focused, almost affectless precision of a man who found numbers more interesting than drama. He had no emotional investment to perform. He had only the evidence. And the evidence was sufficient. Clifford Bryce's cross-examination of Harold lasted 40 minutes and accomplished almost nothing. He challenged the methodology, implied selective data interpretation, and suggested that the LLC's value had been speculative at the time of the disclosure. Harold answered each challenge with the same meticulous patience, citing specific records, correcting specific factual errors in Bryce's questions, and remaining throughout entirely unruffled. At one point, Bryce suggested that Harold's valuation methodology was non-standard. Harold looked at him with the mild, polite expression of a man who has heard that particular argument before and found it unpersuasive the first time, and said, "The methodology is consistent with AICPA forensic accounting standards. I can walk through each element if that would be helpful." Bryce declined. It was during Bryce's examination that the pivot came. Bryce had been trying to establish that the Westerville property transfer was a normal business decision, that David had always planned to contribute it to the LLC, and that the timing relative to the divorce filing was coincidental. Harold had just disagreed, citing email correspondence between David and Greg Harmon that had been produced in discovery. Correspondence that, Harold noted calmly, included a message from David dated 11 months before the divorce filing, in which he explicitly discussed the transfer in the context of protecting assets going forward. Bryce objected. The judge allowed it. Then the judge asked David directly, "Mr. Mitchell, are you aware of the correspondence Dr. Fenn is referencing?" David said he wasn't sure. The judge said, "You aren't sure whether you sent an email 11 months before your divorce was filed in which you discussed protecting assets going forward?" David looked at Clifford Bryce. Bryce gave the infinitesimal headshake of an attorney signaling a client to stop talking. The silence stretched just a beat too long, the kind of silence that fills a room and makes everyone in it slightly uncomfortable except the judge, who simply waited with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world and has seen this particular moment before. "I sent a lot of emails," David said. The silence that followed was not a dramatic silence. It was the silence of a courtroom in which everyone present, including both attorneys, understood what had just happened. I heard Tiffany exhale very quietly beside David. I did not look at her. Judge Sorensen looked at him for a long moment. Unhurried, thorough, the gaze of a person who is cataloging something for later use. Then she turned back to Harold and said, "Continue." Patricia did not look at me. She didn't need to. I felt, very quietly, something release in my chest. Not triumph, not vindication, just the careful, private relief of a thing seen correctly, finally being seen by everyone. The relief of someone who has been carrying a truth alone for a long time and has finally been permitted to set it down in a room full of witnesses. Judge Sorensen issued her ruling 6 weeks after the hearing. It was 41 pages long, and Patricia called me when it arrived, and her voice had in it a warmth I had not heard before. Not the warmth of emotion, but the warmth of a person who has fought many hard fights and recognizes with genuine satisfaction when one has gone the way it should. The court found fraudulent misrepresentation in the original financial disclosure. The settlement was reopened. David was ordered to pay me $287,000, representing my equitable share of the undisclosed LLC equity, the Westerville rental property value, and statutory interest accrued over the period of concealment. He was also ordered to pay $42,000 in attorney's fees, mine, not his, a remedy available under Ohio law when misconduct has caused unnecessary litigation. The total obligation David now faced was $329,000. The number was not abstract. It was the cost of the decision he had made 14 months before filing for divorce, when he had sat down and calculated that he could hide what was mine and that I would not find it. He had been wrong. Tiffany, as a named party, was ordered to surrender her 20% ownership stake in the LLC, which was placed in escrow, pending David's compliance with the payment order. I thought about the moment she had sat at my kitchen table with a bottle of wine and asked me to let it go for the sake of the children. I thought about how she had signed those ownership documents knowing, or choosing not to know, which in practice amounts to the same thing, what they represented. The court had not been interested in the distinction. David's attorney filed a motion to reconsider. It was denied. The denial was issued in 4 sentences, which Patricia told me was unusually brief and conveyed, in judicial economy, everything that needed conveying. He filed a request for a payment plan. The court granted a modified timeline, but held firm on the total amount and required a letter of credit as collateral. There was no negotiating the number down. There was no quiet resolution. There was only the ruling and compliance with it, and the slow, grinding machinery of a man who had bet on my passivity, learning what it costs to be wrong about that. I received the first transfer, $150,000, on a Thursday morning in March. I was sitting at my desk at work when the alert came through on my banking app. I looked at the number for a moment. I thought about the legal pad. The yellow pages covered in my handwriting at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The coffee I hadn't touched. The maple tree tapping against the window. I thought about how far September felt from March, and how much work had existed in that distance, the work that Harold had done, the work that Patricia had done, and the specific, unglamorous daily work of a woman who had decided to keep going when every reasonable voice in her head suggested it would be easier to stop. Then I put my phone face down on the desk, finished the projection I was working on, and emailed my sister. The email said, "It's done." She called me within 30 seconds, and she cried, and I let her, because she had earned the right to cry on my behalf. She had driven to Columbus twice during the hardest weeks. She had listened to every phone call. She had been the steadiest presence through all of it. I thanked her properly and honestly and told her I would explain everything at Sunday dinner. There is something I want to be specific about because I think it matters. I did not feel the victory the way I might have expected to. I did not feel elation. I felt something more durable than elation. A kind of rightness, the sensation of a crooked thing having been straightened. Not for the money, though the money was real and important, and would fund my children's college accounts and repair the porch roof, and allow me to breathe slightly differently for the next several years. Not even entirely for justice in the abstract sense, though that mattered too. I felt it for Lily's voice on the phone in September. For the 9-year-old girl who had been handed a reclassification of her mother as part of someone's wedding celebration and didn't have the vocabulary to understand what had been done to her. For the 7-year-old boy crying in the background. For the version of myself who had sat at a kitchen table with an untouched glass of wine and a legal pad and made herself be brave enough to follow a thread she was frightened of pulling. What happened to Clifford Bryce's ugly hearing threat? It did not materialize because when the evidence is sufficiently clear, theater becomes expensive. Bryce was professional to the end. I'll give him that. But there was no character assassination, no recitation of my marital failures, because the moment Harold's 67-page report entered the record, the hearing had only one subject: numbers. And numbers, as I had known since the beginning, do not lie and cannot be charmed, and are not moved by a silver suit or a practiced expression of injured innocence. I called Patricia after the final transfer cleared and thanked her. She said, "You did the work, I just filed the paperwork." That wasn't quite true. But I understood what she meant, and I let her have it. Because there is a generosity in allowing people who helped you to feel the weight of what they contributed. She had contributed enormously. So had Harold. So had Renata, and my sister, and the women in the church basement in Clintonville. This had not been a solitary victory. It had been a collective one, built from the particular courage of every person who had said yes, keep going when I needed to hear it most. David had one more thing to say to me. He sent a text, through official channels this time, documented, brief, that said, "I hope you're satisfied." I did not respond. There was nothing to say that the court record hadn't already said more cleanly, more permanently, and with considerably more authority than anything I could have put into a text message at the end of all of it. Spring came early that year, or maybe I just noticed it more than usual. The maple tree put out its first leaves in late March, small and tender and very green, and I sat on the porch swing with a cup of coffee on a Saturday morning and watched them and felt, I want to find the exact word for this. I felt uncrowded, as if something that had been taking up space inside me for years, long before the divorce, long before the phone call, had finally been removed, and the remaining space was now simply mine. I paid off the remaining balance on the house in April. I typed in the payoff amount, submitted it, and received the confirmation email at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning while Lily and Noah were eating cereal at the kitchen table. I told them, I just paid off the house. Lily looked up and said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means this house is fully ours now. Nobody can take it." Noah said, "Cool," and went back to his cereal. But Lily watched me for a moment with those careful eyes that have always seen more than she lets on, and she smiled. Not wide, not performative, just a small, certain smile. And that smile was worth more to me than the confirmation email. I was promoted in May. Senior partner track, offered in a meeting that lasted 20 minutes and ended with a handshake and a number. I did not have to negotiate. My manager said I had been remarkably focused during a period when she knew I had some personal things going on. I thanked her and accepted without hesitation. I started running again that summer. Not competitively, just 3 mornings a week, early, before the neighborhood fully woke up. It became the part of the day I protected most fiercely. 40 minutes of moving through the world with nothing required of me except to keep going. As for David and Tiffany, I did not seek information about them. But the consequences arrived, the way practical consequences tend to arrive when a financial structure built on deception is legally dismantled. The LLC had to sell one of the commercial properties in a timeline that was not advantageous. Greg Harmon, according to a mutual acquaintance, was deeply unhappy about the forced sale. The Westerville rental house was sold to cover part of the judgment. The white leather couch was gone. They had moved to a smaller apartment. What I know about Tiffany came mostly through the children's unself-conscious fragments. The apartment was quieter now. Daddy seemed stressed a lot, and Tiffany had started working full-time at a job she apparently did not enjoy. None of this gave me satisfaction. What it gave me was confirmation of something I had believed for a long time, that structures built on false foundations require continuous, exhausting maintenance, and that energy has to come from somewhere. Lily turned 10 in June. I threw her a birthday party in the backyard, rented, bouncy castle, homemade cake, 12 10-year-olds running in circles until their voices went hoarse. My mother put her arm around my shoulders at one point and said, "I was wrong. You knew what you were doing." I said, "I had good help." She said, "You were the one who made the calls." Maybe that's what it comes down to. Not heroics, not a master plan. Just a series of calls made at the right time to the right people. Each one a small act of refusing to accept that the story was already finished because someone else had decided it was. Noah scored his first soccer goal in August. He turned around with the most purely joyful expression I have ever seen on a human face and found me in the crowd immediately, the way children find their mothers. I raised both arms and cheered until Renata laughed and covered her ears. I was there. I have always been there. That, more than the court ruling, more than the financial restitution, that was the victory. The truth is patient. It lives in spreadsheets, in public records, in emails sent by men who believed they were being clever. It doesn't announce itself, but it never disappears either. I was afraid at nearly every step. But fear, I learned, is not the opposite of action. It is simply the weather you act inside of. Would you have pulled that thread? I'd genuinely love to know. Leave a comment. Your perspective matters more than you think. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And thank you truly for staying until the very end.